Okay, this is a block on visual cultures, and I think the first thing to say is we live in an increasingly visual world. A world in which we see more and more pictures, and moving pictures as well, and less words. Now, we need to think about the history of the camera. The camera is really an invention of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The first cameras allowed you to take one picture. You couldn't copy it, you couldn't print it, it was just a picture, so it was a bit like a unique painting. The evolution of the camera goes through a period where you use something called film. I'm not sure any of you have seen a cartridge of film, but the film goes into the back of the camera. It's a plastic film, and you take the picture. Once you've taken the pictures, you take the film to a developer. Developer turns it into a negative, and then the developer turns it into a print. Again, pretty restrictive. For a lot of the time in the history of photography, there was a question about whether photography is art. Is it aesthetically as good as, or indeed the same as, painting? I'm not particularly hugely concerned with that debate, although it still rages on today. There is an assumption, for example, that black and white photography is more difficult and therefore is more aesthetically valuable, and is something that only really professionals can do. The really critical development in photography was, as we'll see in the next section on social media, the development of digital photography. So a digital photography would include a digital camera, it would include a smartphone, which is multifunctional. And indeed, the interesting thing is increasingly the technology that people use to take pictures and make little videos, or indeed big videos, is multifunctional. Unlike early cameras, you can now actually edit your images on your smartphone, on your camera. So in a sense, one of the effects of that is to democratize the taking of pictures. We no longer have to rely on experts to take pictures for us. We can do it ourselves. We have, in other words, become prosumers. Just to take an example of that, we used to rely, and indeed the police used to rely, when crimes were committed, on taking pictures of crime scenes or taking pictures of ongoing crimes. Now people can take pictures of events going on in the world, can post those, and they become news. So we are both producers and consumers of images simultaneously. So that's a brief history of photography. We need to look now at social media, and in a way social media have been facilitated by digital technology. And it's obvious, social media, you'll all know what it includes. It includes YouTube, for those people who still use it. It includes Instagram, Twitter, and so on. And it's extraordinary the way these technologies have expanded the use and dissemination of visual images. The estimate is that in 2016, every day, there were 158 million posts on Snapchat and 60 million on Instagram. 220 million pictures are posted every single day. So, just multiply that for a year, and it's gone up since 2016. So it's truly extraordinary expansion of the use of visual images produced by prosumers. So sociologically, we need to think about what's going on here. Why is there this obsession, for example, with taking selfies? I'm going to ask you during this session on social media to actually take some selfies and discuss what's going on. One thing that's going on for sociologists is that in late modern societies, identity formation and change are critical. We're encouraged to constantly think about our identity and to constantly attempt to change it through different patterns of consumption, for example. So one of the things that's going on with the expansion of the selfie is about identity and identity formation and identity change. The second thing that's going on is, I think I'm going to call it a confusion of what is private. Confusion about the private sphere. So for example, when you're applying for a job, you'll be warned to have a look at what sort of stuff you're posting on Instagram, what you're putting on YouTube, what you're putting on Facebook. And of course what a lot of people do, they put pictures of private activities and then put them on Instagram, put them on Twitter, and they become public. So we're getting either a confusion about what is private and public, or we're getting the abolition of the private sphere. Finally, there is a question for sociologists about to what extent the use of Instagram, the use of Snapchat, the taking of selfies is an example of narcissism. Now, narcissism in the early part of the 20th century was seen as a clinical condition that individuals suffer from. And then the sociologist Christopher Lasch wrote a book called The Culture of Narcissism. And he argued that, and this was before the expansion of social media, he argued that we live in a society that is so attached to notions of identity that we've become narcissistic. We have fallen in love with ourselves, with the selves that we disseminate through social media. So I guess the warning I'm giving you before you go and get a job is to make sure there's nothing embarrassing on social media. One of the questions we have to think about when we're doing a beliefs course and looking at photography is, how do you actually interpret and read a photograph? What we're going to do in this section, we're going to look at a particular photograph by the American photographer Dorothea Lange called Migrant Mother. And we're going to think, it's a black and white picture, we're going to think about how you might decide what it's about. What does it mean? The question is, what do we need to know in order to decide what this photograph means? Well, the first thing we need to know, and it's not priorities, is the technology. What sort of camera was she using? She wasn't using a digital camera. She was taking black and white pictures. And this migrant mother is one of many photographs taken of poor, impoverished American workers. So the second thing we would probably want to know is the biography of the photographer. And obviously one really significant element in Dorothea Lange's biography is that she was a woman, she had a disability, and she was one of the very few women taking photographs of this kind in the United States between the two wars. So we need to know about history, the historical period. Historical period of depression, of rural depopulation, of huge levels of poverty, of huge levels of rural unemployment. We need to know about the politics, who was in power, who was sponsoring what was in effect a very large photo project involving lots and lots of photographers, mainly men, as I've said. We need to know about how and to what extent these photographs and this particular photograph could be reproduced. So what means of reproduction were available for disseminating this photograph? As you'll see, if you look on the web, you can now buy a copy of this photograph and you can hang it in your room. And I think it's a fantastic photograph, and indeed one of the questions we need to think about here is, what is it that makes a great photograph? Is this simply a personal opinion? Or is this an objective thing? We need to think about the viewer, you. We need to think about the viewer and the social location of the viewer. It may well be, and it does turn out to be the case, that women tend to interpret this photograph in a different way than men do. Ethnic minority people tend to interpret it in a different way than majorities do. People with disabilities tend to interpret this photograph in a different way than people without disabilities, and so on. Now, all of this has got a label, and the label is Discourse Analysis. What we're doing when we look at these various facets of the photograph, the technology, the history, the politics, how the image was reproduced, we're doing something called discourse analysis. And discourse analysis gives a very strong role to the viewer. The viewer becomes central in the process of doing discourse analysis, which is one of the reasons I'm going to ask you to do a discourse analysis of this image. What you will not get from discourse analysis is one interpretation. You'll get different interpretations and you will disagree about those interpretations. So we might ask a question, and I'm not going to answer it. Who is right? What is the correct interpretation? And I'll give you the answer now. There isn't one. Unless you are happy for me to say my interpretation is the correct one because I'm the lecturer and you're the student. Very few of us have any direct experience of crime. We rely on media, social media, print media, film, television, cable TV, HBO to get knowledge of crime. What I'm going to do in this session, I'm going to look at visual representations of organised crime. In particular, what in a lot of Hollywood films and some cable television channels are called Mafia. So I'm looking at visual representations, particularly in film, of Mafia. Now it's important to emphasise that despite what you see in films and TV channels and TV programmes, there is more than one mafia. So it's a plural. There's mafias. There are mafias, and this is where most Hollywood films focus. Is the dominant image of mafias in film and indeed in TV channels is Italian mafia, what's called the Cosa Nostra. As we'll see, there are at least 3 different mafias in Italy. We'll talk about them in the session. And there are organised crime networks, which people call mafia, in many, many countries. Japan, the former Soviet Union, South America, just about everywhere you go, you will find organised crime. So let's think about filmic mafias. What do they focus on? Well, they focus on family. They focus on tradition, particularly religious tradition. They focus on community. They focus on migration. We're going to look at the Godfather Trilogy and the television series The Sopranos. In the Godfather Trilogy, there is a lot of extreme violence. There's no comedy and there's no sex. It's all very serious and actually very scary. In The Sopranos, there is a lot of extreme violence, there's a lot of sex, and there's a lot of comedy. So the dimensions of violence, sex, and comedy. The other thing we're going to look at is something called intertextuality. Now, intertextuality is a situation where something that's in one film reappears in another film in a different form. So in The Godfather, there is Michael Corleone, the hero, if you want to call him that, says,
"Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in."
Which means that he wants to get out of the mafia and they pull you back into the mafia. There's a thunderstorm going on and he has a heart attack, so it's dead serious.
Our true enemy has not yet shown his face.
I don't know.
Has he got his medicine?
I don't know what he's doing. He doesn't want.
In The Sopranos, characters constantly say the same thing and turn it into comedy.
Cheer me up, babe.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Huh? Zappuccino. Fucking spitting image.
Vincent Rizzo.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. Thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
The characters laugh at the repeat of that statement. And that's what intertextuality is, something that keeps appearing in subsequent films, but in a different form.